Câncer, doenças cardiovasculares, demência, diabetes e etc. É isso que se espera da maior parte da população nos dias de hoje. A maioria das pessoas tende a se preocupar com esses problemas quando chegam os exames positivos, ou até mesmo quando a idade fica batendo a sua porta querendo forçar a entrada. Estamos sempre nos preocupando com coisas banais nos nossos 20 e poucos anos, enquanto que a cada ano que passa, nosso corpo tem ficado mais cansado e envelhecendo. E quando chegamos aos nossos 45 anos de idade, queremos nos preocupar com as medidas de prevenção dessas mesmas doenças. Eu também pensava dessa maneira até que eu assisti a esse podcast.
It's not that the Titanic didn't see the iceberg, it's that it didn't see the iceberg in time. It didn't have enough runway to really move out of the way, and that's why the Titanic gashed the side of the boat. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, a 30-year-old like you has unbelievable potential to change the arc of your life. The problem is, and I'm not just speaking to you personally, but more broadly to someone who's as young as you, it's harder to find the motivation because there are no reminders of your own mortality. You're Superman, right? The worst thing that happens to you is a hangover. So I always get asked, like, when is the right time to start worrying about this? And the short answer is, look, as soon as possible. A lot of people in their 20s and 30s who are making good money aren't necessarily taking the most prudent financial steps to ensure financial freedom when they're in their 70s.
Doutor Peter Attia é um médico de renome mundial, formado em medicina pela Universidade de Stanford. Ele é mais conhecido por ter os segredos para viver uma vida longa, saudável e feliz. Ele escreveu um dos livros que já ajudou milhares de pessoas, chamado Outlive, a arte e a ciência de viver mais e melhor. Em uma de suas entrevistas, ele explica os maiores problemas que nós temos em alcançar uma vida mais longa e saudável. Por isso mesmo, no vídeo de hoje, vamos reagir a essa entrevista e descobrir o que ele tem a nos ensinar. Vamos lá.
Today, most people listening to us are going to die from cardiovascular disease, from cancer, dementia or other neurodegenerative diseases, complications of diabetes. And on the one hand, that's a sign of progress. It means like, hey, we're living long enough to die from those things. But we've made scant progress against those things. In fact, if you go back and strip out the top 8 causes of infectious death or communicable death, death from communicable diseases or infectious diseases, today, if you strip them out, our life expectancy is not much better than it was in the 1800s. If we want to really figure out a way to live longer, and I would argue more importantly, live better, meaning when we're in the last decades of our life, not be in a state of total decline, we need a totally different playbook. And that playbook is Medicine 3.0, and it involves real prevention. So that means taking true steps at prevention very early in life. It also involves being very personalized in how you do things. So it means you can't just do paint by numbers. You can't just sort of say the same thing to everybody. Clearly, there are certain things that make absolute sense across the board, such as sleep and exercise, but the way you might use medications is going to have to be much more tailored to an individual.
You say that there are 4 points to Medicine 3.0, which is the prevention, the being unique in your treatment to each individual, an honest assessment and acceptance of risk.
Yeah. One of the things that I don't think we think enough about as doctors sometimes is risk, right? Now, I think doctors are very good at thinking about the risk of doing something.
Yeah.
I think, usually a doctor is pretty good at understanding, if you have this surgical procedure, there's a risk of an infection, there's a risk of bleeding, there's a risk of all of these things. If you take this medicine, there's a risk of this side effect or that side effect. But I don't think we spend enough time thinking about the risk of not acting or the risk of not acting when we do. So this is where I think it gets a bit more nuanced. Prevention doesn't come without risk, right? I mean, you're still going to have to do something in the state of prevention. So the question is understanding the time horizon upon which you're considering risk. So I'll give you one very specific example. At least in the US, and it might be the same in the UK, we only really think about the risk of heart disease over a 10-year time horizon. So look at someone like you. You're 30 years old, right? So what is your 10-year risk of having a heart attack? I can tell you without knowing anything about you, it's really low.
Good.
It's as close to zero as we could have in medicine. But what if I did a blood test on you and I found biomarkers in there that were predictive of very high risk later in life? Now that would be actually quite possible. There's about a 1 in 10 chance you might have a biomarker called Lp(a), for example, which is just a certain lipid in your body. About a 1 in 10 chance you have that dramatically increases your risk of cardiovascular disease.
My uncle died very early, I believe in his 50s, of a cardiovascular disease.
Interesting. So knowing that, by the way, could be helpful because that would prompt me to ask you more questions and want to know more about all the people in your family. So here we have a 1 in 10 chance. And by the way, we wouldn't leave it to chance. We would just check it. And let's say we checked your level and you had that lipoprotein, or you had an elevated level of another lipoprotein, apolipoprotein little b. And again, these are kind of technical terms, but they're very common things and they're easy to measure. The medicine 2.0 view here would be, well, there's nothing wrong with you now, and there's not going to be anything wrong with you for the next 10 years. We don't need to do anything about it. Conversely, if I take a lifetime view of risk, I would say, yeah, but the risk to something happening in the next 40 years is actually quite significant. So my risk of doing nothing is probably much higher than my risk of doing something today. So my risk of doing something today would be non-zero but small, but my risk of doing nothing, if I take the appropriate time horizon, is much bigger.
This is one of the things in your book that really, really got me thinking was, I have to say, and I believe a lot of people probably feel the same way, I've gone through my life thinking, to some degree, I'll worry about avoiding these diseases later. I'll when I get to 45, then I'll start taking this thing seriously. Because then I'm getting into that territory where most people I know that get cancer or Alzheimer's or all of these cardiovascular things, that's when it tends to happen. So I'll think about it then.
Totally understandable. And I'll frame this in the context of a question I get asked all the time, which is, hey, Peter, when is the best time to start thinking about this stuff? And I say, look, I can't answer that because there are two competing issues that are crossing. When I meet somebody who's in the last decade of their life, do you know how much they are thinking about this? Like, it's all they're thinking about. It's all they're thinking about. Every minute of every day is a confrontation with their own mortality. The problem is they don't have much time to change the direction of the ship. You may recall in the book, I use the metaphor of the Titanic, right? It's not that the Titanic didn't see the iceberg. It's that it didn't see the iceberg in time. It didn't have enough runway to really move out of the way, and that's why the Titanic gashed the side of the boat. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, a 30-year-old like you has unbelievable potential to change the arc of your life. You have so much runway through manipulating nutrition and exercise and sleep and stress and all of these things, to completely alter the disease trajectory of your life. The problem is, and I'm not just speaking to you personally, but more broadly to someone who's as young as you, it's harder to find the motivation because there are no reminders of your own mortality. You're Superman, right? The worst thing that happens to you is a hangover. So I always get asked, like, when is the right time to start worrying about this? And the short answer is, look, as soon as possible. But then there's a reality that says for most people, it's not until they're in their 40s, maybe once they have kids, that they start to appreciate their own mortality, and that provides some of the motivation to say, you know, maybe I'll be a little less focused on optimizing everything for today, and I'll start thinking a little bit about tomorrow. So again, another way to think about this is saving for retirement. A lot of people in their 20s and 30s who are making good money aren't necessarily taking the most prudent financial steps to ensure financial freedom when they're in their 70s. Because, let's be honest, it's more enjoyable to spend money today than to set some of it aside. But there are a lot of people later in life who think, I wish I was a little bit more responsible earlier on.
How early do some of these disease, if you looked at my sort of metabolic health, or if you were able to look inside my body, which I'm sure you're able to do, how early do some of these diseases begin in my life? At what age do you see some of these things coming?
Yeah, it's super interesting because there are some elements of you as a person that are going downhill the minute you're born, and there are others that are not. So let's use 2 examples. Let's start with something where your body is getting better and better, and you're probably only peaking now, but you haven't really started to age. Your muscle quality. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you were 5 years old, your muscle quality was nothing like it is today. But as you enter your 20s, the quality of those muscle fibers, these type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So these are kind of slow to fatigue, but high endurance fibers are the type 1 fibers. The type 2 fibers are very, very powerful, but they're kind of quick to fatigue. The quality of both of those fibers is very high. And the more you train them, the higher quality they will be. But as you enter your 30s, you will now start to experience a shrinkage of those type 2 muscle fibers. You will be less powerful in your 30s, in your late 30s especially, than you were in your mid to late 20s. So that's a form of aging. Mm-hmm. You are declining. It's not an accident that the most powerful athletes in the world are at their peak in their late 20s and early 30s. So sprinters, for example, mm-hmm. That's a prime example of a pure power sport. We look at other things like more of your muscular endurance that will peak even a little bit later. You can keep that going a little bit later. We look at certain forms of cognition. So if we look at something called fluid intelligence, right? This is raw horsepower processing speed. You have more of it right now than I do, meaning you're going to have faster processing speed, better memory. All of these things are going to be better when you're 30 than at my age. I'm 50. Because that's already started to decline in me. There are some things, however, that began aging in you the minute you were born. And one of them is actually going back to this idea of atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease. Well, that's an example of a disease process that begins right away at birth. And even though it almost never rears its head as far as death before you're 50, make no mistake about it, it's starting on day 1. And we know this, by the way, because when we look at studies of people who die for completely unrelated reasons, so somebody who, dies in a car accident or soldiers dying in war, and we look at the arteries of their heart, we already see quite advanced disease. Really? So the truth of it is, you already have pretty significant disease in your coronary arteries. It hasn't risen to the level of ever causing a heart attack, and it's unlikely to do so for another 20 years, maybe even another 30 years. But
it's compounding.
It is compounding, exactly.
Like
and
money.
If you want to live to be 90 free of cardiovascular disease, it makes a big difference if you can slow it down when you're in your 20s and 30s.
Galera, a ideia de que nós só nos preocupamos com os nossos problemas quando eles chegam é literalmente uma forma padronizada de pensarmos, e isso é um facto. O Dr. Attia tocou num assunto muito interessante. Nós que estamos entre os 20 e poucos anos, nos preocupamos em aproveitar essa idade de maneira a esgotar todos os nossos poderes energéticos e saudáveis que a nossa juventude nos oferece. E esquecemos que precisamos viver. Todo ser humano por natureza quer ter uma vida mais longa e saudável para aproveitar com as pessoas que amamos, e queremos que as pessoas que amamos também tenham essa mesma vida mais longa e saudável para aproveitar conosco. E o melhor momento para garantirmos isso é exatamente esse que estamos desperdiçando. Eu não estou aqui dizendo que você precisa parar de sair com os amigos ou com as amigas, parar de beber, comer todo tipo de comida, saborear todo tipo de doçura ou etc. A decisão de fazer isso é totalmente sua, mas é como o Dr. Attia havia mencionado antes, não é como se as pessoas do Titanic não tivessem visto o iceberg. Elas viram, só que viram tarde demais. A questão não é ver ou começar a prevenir esses problemas. A questão é quando você vai começar a fazer isso. Sempre foi o tempo. Se você chegou até aqui, por favor, se inscreva no canal, pois isso me ajuda muito. E diga nos comentários o que você achou desse conteúdo de hoje. Muito obrigado.